Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jean-Michel Giraud, the President and CEO of Friendship Place. Welcome to the Housing Solutions, the Journey Home 2020 virtual symposium presented by Friendship Place and co-sponsored and produced by NYU DC. Today's conversation is an important one as we explore and find solutions as a community to develop partnerships in order to bring about housing stability and affordability. During our conversations, we will explore topics such as a nation, some experts say we have resources to end homelessness, so why don't we? As we focus on affordable housing, we must recognize that some people can't even afford that. Thus, what does it mean to build deeply affordable housing too? What is HUD's role in this work, and how will the pandemic impact the process? Before we get started, I would like to thank NYU DC. Your partnership is truly appreciated, and we look forward to working with you again in the coming years. I would also like to thank our esteemed panelists. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to help make this possible. And finally, thank you to our moderator, Mr. Ray Suarez. Over to you, Ray.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Michel. It's great to be able to join the symposium for another year, even in these unusual times. And thank you to my alma mater, NYU, for being a co-sponsor. The panelists will discuss the journey a family may take from short-term housing to voucher-supported housing and to low-cost options in the area. The goal of this program is to discuss how nonprofit organizations, advocates, and corporations work together on that journey. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're really pleased they could be with us this year. Joseph LeMense is Managing Director for United Bank's Nonprofit and Community Development Group. Mr. LeMense has almost 4 banking experience in the greater region. His areas of expertise include affordable housing, owner-occupied commercial real estate lending, asset-based lending, and others. We're also joined by Jeffery Hayward, Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer of Fannie Mae. Mr. Hayward is responsible for the company's mission-critical work on affordable housing and environmental, social, and governance matters. He began in this role at Fannie Mae just recently after 8 years as the head of the multifamily unit. Nan Roman is with us, President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. It's a public education, advocacy, and capacity building organization. She's a leading national voice in the area of homelessness. Ms. Roman works closely with members of Congress and the administration and with state and local officials on housing issues. James Campbell joins us. He's the principal for Somerset Development. Mr. Campbell has led the company in identifying, analyzing, and packaging the financing for Somerset's real estate development portfolio with approximately 2,300 multifamily residential units in 17 properties, along with retail and community buildings completed and under development. And Michele S. Williams, the founder of Michele S. Williams, LLC, has over 25 years' experience in providing services to vulnerable populations, including persons with disabilities, individuals, and families experiencing homelessness in low-income communities. She's an expert in program development and implementation and continuum of care management. We'll get opening statements from all of our panelists, sort of setting the table for us to begin our conversation, and we'll begin with Joseph LeMense.
Thank you, Ray, and you fortunately broke up just in time to say how many years I've been in banking, so I appreciate
good.
that. So my name is Joe LeMense. I head up our community development nonprofit banking group. A subset of that practice is a substantial prioritization of affordable housing. I think we're all here today because we understand the tremendous need that maybe this current recession has made worse. And as a $26 billion community bank with operations in 8 states from Ohio down through the Carolinas, we feel an obligation both morally and as a business to give back to the communities in which we source deposits. So we have had a lengthy history in the development of affordable housing, ranging from all aspects, multifamily, for sale, affordable, et cetera. So I'm just happy to be here today.
Next, Jeffery Hayward of Fannie Mae. And unmute yourself, Mr. Hayward.
Hi, this is a great opportunity for to be with you all today. I am in my day job in charge of all the work that the company does around affordable housing, and recently ran the multifamily business, which really did all of the multifamily affordable transactions. But the real reason I'm on this panel today is I've been a board member of the National Alliance to End Homelessness for around 11 years, and it's my personal passion to make sure that this kind of work, the work to make sure everyone has a decent place in America to live, that is something that I'm really dedicated to, and it is in my personal capacity that I'm with you all today.
Next, Nan Roman, president of the National Alliance to End Homelessness.
Thanks so much. I'm going to give a little overview of homeless families to get us started, to orient us a bit. Prior to the pandemic, there were about 570,000 people homeless every night in the US. About 30% of them were people living in families. 103,000 of them were children. Here in DC, just before the pandemic hit, there were 2,400 people living in almost 800 families with 1,400 children. So that's a lot of people who were homeless, but it is 8% fewer people in families that were homeless last year and 30% fewer than were homeless in 2015. So in the district, we've been moving in the right direction. Families are homeless largely because they don't make enough money to afford housing. Families here in DC would need an income of $68,000 a year to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment and still have enough to meet all their other needs, clothes, food, transportation, daycare, et cetera. That's using the federal low-income affordability standard. 51,000 households in DC don't make that much. They are poor and they make $34,000 a year or below. We are 30,000 units short of having enough rental units to meet the demand of those families. For every 10 low-income households that need an affordable apartment, there are only 4 apartments. As a result, families are paying too much of their incomes for rent, or they're doubling up with other families, or they're going on the years-long waiting list for subsidized housing. And eventually, some of these stopgap measures fall apart and they become homeless. So these families either need to earn more or they have to pay less for housing. As it stands, they can't make it in the short run without rental subsidy. COVID-19 has had a negative impact on this picture, with more families staying doubled up, domestic violence increasing, children's educations being impacted, and jobs disappearing. The recession has taken its toll as women and people in lower paying jobs are most affected by both job loss and COVID. And there's tremendous racial disproportionality also at play, as homeless families are disproportionately people of color, and COVID and the recession also have disproportionate impacts on people of color. In DC, 95% of adults in families are African American, while African Americans are only 47% of the DC population. So these are some of the issues that we'll be discussing today, I think, in regard to families and housing in the District of Columbia.
Next, James Campbell from Somerset Development.
Thank you, Ray. Again, my name is James Campbell, principal with Somerset Development Company. Somerset is a mission-driven, for-profit developer. We specialize in the revitalization of distressed urban communities, and we develop affordable housing, mixed-income housing, and market housing. And we've developed projects that try to integrate homeless and formerly homeless households into a permanent housing with a service-rich environment. And we have had just what I would consider tremendous success with that approach. But as Nan said, there is a crisis of affordability supply, for supply of affordable housing in the district. And so we need to be creative, the private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector working together to find ways to really attack that supply issue. One strategy that Somerset has employed is to try to tap into the market strength. The booming housing market that has really negatively impacted the availability of affordable housing throughout the area is something that we see as something we can tap into to cross-subsidize the production of additional affordable housing. A prime example of that is Portland Place on U Street, a development where we took a very low density, very rundown, low income project, and we were able to upzone it. We were able to spin off a market component. We were able to use the proceeds from the sale of that market component to be the gap subsidy source for building a brand new, beautiful affordable housing project that doubled the number of affordable housing on that site, bringing all of the original residents back. That kind of approach to tap into the market, but other creative methods we need to all work together to find to deal with this supply crisis.
And finally, Michele Williams. Ms. Williams?
Thank you, Ray. I'm so glad to be able to be here today and to be able to be on the panel with all of you. My background is in nonprofits. I've worked in nonprofits for nearly my entire career across various social service areas. And I can't think of a single one where housing was not a critical issue for persons receiving services from every agency. And so, as Nan stated, the scope of the problem is extremely large, and nonprofits can play a huge role in partnering with developers and with communities and funders to provide the housing and supports that individuals need to have that solid foundation to be able to address larger challenges, but also to be able to achieve the same equitable indicators of our society in terms of quality of life. So thank you so much.
I want to begin talking to the panel, sort of a little bit about the elephant in the room. One of the reasons why we're talking to each other in little boxes this year, instead of in front of a big audience at NYU downtown, is the COVID pandemic. It's caused severe downward pressure on incomes, lost overtime, lost hours, lost jobs. Families that might have just scraped by with 2 low-income wage earners in a city like DC now suddenly have 1 or none, no money for rent, no money for utilities. That's an immediate short-term shock to a family's finances, and housing decisions tend to be something that's made over a longer timeline, but you still have to respond to the near-in crisis. I'm wondering how we massage the different timelines between these two things, housing and the right now, right in your face, severe downturn that a lot of families have faced. Nan or Michele, who wants to get us started? Unmute yourself, Nan.
Yep. One thing I could say that's been helpful, at least in this, is the eviction moratoria. Of course, there's a big question of whether that strategy is going to turn out to have been a good one. But it has, for a lot of people, as you mentioned, with interrupted incomes and inability to pay their rent, it has prevented evictions. They still are going to owe the rent, and when those are over, we need to get rental assistance to help them. But that is one thing I think that's stabilized their housing situations.
I think a lot of people don't realize that amount due just gets loaded onto future months' rent bills.
Yeah.
Family incomes are not going to climb in a way that's going to allow many of these people who will just be getting back to work to cover those accruals. Are there already existing programs so that this isn't a slow motion homelessness crisis where people aren't being evicted in January and February, sort of as a hangover from the pandemic that began in the early part of this year?
Well, I'll just say, and then I'll turn it over to Michele, but that there are some existing programs, but nowhere near the scope. And so groups like ours are trying very hard to get money in a new stimulus bill, should there ever be one, for rental assistance. The current House proposal is $50 billion for rental assistance, basically to solve exactly, Ray, the problem you raised, which is when the eviction moratorium ends, which it will at some point, people are going to owe all this money. If they had the money, they would have been paying their rent. So there has to be some assistance at the back end. And also, I just should mention it's very unfair to landlords that are just not getting paid and also have their own bills. It's a bad situation, but it has at least forestalled evictions till now.
I hope you don't mind. I want to jump in here for a second and just on the point that Nan made, which is, I think in a public policy debate, we would all do ourselves good to understand the connection between kind of the landlords and them paying real estate taxes and how that's going to affect affordable housing in the future. So as solutions are brought forward, we do have to be thoughtful and not see landlords as just villains. And some of them absolutely are, and I'm not saying they aren't. But I do think as we think about policy making, we should think individuals are going to need assistance, but we're going to have to figure out a way in solving this economic problem to deal with the fact that landlords, if they don't get paid rent or get paid in some way, they're not going to be able to pay real estate taxes, and that's going to matter. And it'll matter greatly, and we'll actually harm ourselves.
Or their mortgages, or the common carriage costs that come up for lighting hallways and maintaining parking lots and all the other things that go along with that.
We're in the solution area. Just ought to think about part of what landlords do is bad stuff like evict people, and they ought to be dealt with. But it's not as simple as that, and we ought to have some policies that deals with the reality, particularly of small landlords. Of they're going to need some help.
And just
Michele?
as an example of that, we have a mortgage with Joe and United Bank on an affordable housing project that we are hoping to redevelop and triple the number of affordable units. But keeping that mortgage current is a big issue. We very aggressively work with, and we have resident service staff and house and at the properties working with people who are facing this kind of economic dislocation to tap into whatever resources that might exist. The district does have some programs. There's a number of foundations that support programs. As Nan said, not adequate to the scale of the problem. And so we fight like we can to have our residents be first in line, and it helps. But ultimately, we've got to pay those property taxes. We have to maintain the buildings. We have to pay the mortgage. I think what I worry about is that landlords, particularly those who are trying to, all the nonprofit developers and owners are facing the same squeeze. Tenants have economic dislocation. There's a moratorium on eviction. Therefore, rents are way, way down. Lenders have given a couple months of deferral on mortgage payments. We fortunately haven't had to do that with United, but Fannie has a program doing that. But the landlord is going to get squeezed, and it's not just us for-profit. It's all of the nonprofit owners and developers in DC are facing it in a big way right now.
I think that these comments really highlight the fact that the pandemic has created an unknown situation for everyone. We have not just the scope of kind of a single disaster that affects a limited area of our community, but one that is impacting every single entity in person in the country. And so, and there's a lot to be seen. We have no real end date for that. So it's very hard to plan for the level of resource that's going to be needed to really address the needs of all of the parties in dealing with the effects of this pandemic. And I don't want us to forget that this is happening on top of what was already a crisis around people experiencing homelessness in this country. And so trying to figure out how to address those needs as well as the needs of literally everyone else at the same time is a huge challenge. And I certainly commend all of us for working for getting the appropriate resources in place to help deal with that. But there's still so much that We don't know, and that's yet to be seen. So we have to do as much as we can right now.
So what's interesting as a
LeMense,
bank, yeah. Oh, were you going to ask
Go
me a
ahead.
question?
No, I was going to ask you a question, but you have something to add. Go ahead, add it.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So what's interesting from a bank's perspective is, the bank is only as strong and solvent as the clients that it deals with. And, one could argue DC has its unique characteristics. We are heartened by the fact that in times like these, particularly multifamily is probably the most stable asset class, and LIHTC financed, intentionally low income multifamily has an even more robust risk profile than the norm. While we are keeping our eye on malls and retail and commercial office space, have fortunately not had much disruption in the multifamily world. I always tell my market colleagues that my tenants may not make as much money as some of their millennial millionaires, but they also can't be house poor based on how the deals are underwritten. Now, admittedly, you can lose your job, and our bank has been robust in many or most PPP loans. I think the biggest issue at this point is no one thought we were going to be into October still dealing with these issues. PPP has been extended and the like. The moratoriums have been extended, but the longer you go, we envision some stress fractures sooner than later.
You anticipated my question, because I was going to point out, and as James Campbell mentioned earlier, that even in the midst of an economic downturn, the DC housing market remains healthy, sale prices remain high, and it remains one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. And the low interest horizon seems to stretch on forever. So there are definitely winners in this marketplace. And at the same time, many persistently low income households with one or two wage earners or even more, many insecurely housed people, simply left to its own devices, the marketplace creates a lot of low income jobs and a lot of high cost housing. Does some sort of institution, device, legislation, does something have to interpose itself into that market? Because left to its own devices, we'll make a lot of high-cost units and a lot of low-wage jobs, and those two things are not connecting up very well.
Well, I've got a couple of views on this, and I'm sure my colleagues will join in. I think the first thing is how zoning is done in a place like Washington, D.C. has to change so more units can come on stream. The way zoning works, it actually makes the problem worse. It's much easier to build a market rate or to rehab a market rate, do more market rate than it is to have a mixed neighborhood that has affordable in-market rates. So part of this is a real new look and a focus on zoning to get the zoning part right. I think that the other thing is, and it seems like it's trite, but it really isn't. Public and private folks have got to figure out how to leverage each other to solve the problem. And I think a specific example could be, there's a bunch of COVID funding out there now. It would be great if we could get public and private entities together to see, can we convert motels to a place that people could live at that's cheaper? Motels are kind of close to use that you could have. Can we convert hotels? Is there a way to have public partnerships that really deal with private partnerships that deal with some of these issues, and use some of the COVID money that's out? That's just a thought of mine, but I'm sure my peers here have lots of other thoughts.
We've spent a couple of $1 trillion in the past couple of months. People are ready to think big and think in a kind of emergency situation kind of way that they weren't a year ago. Does it create possibilities for inventing new things that simply weren't there before? Are there things that are possible now or plausible now that didn't used to be, because we are in this unusual moment in the history of the country?
This is Nan. I would say, following up on what Jeff said, and also in response to your question, for example, in California, the governor has used the state's coronavirus relief funds, which were stimulus funds that were given to states and localities. I may get the numbers wrong, but I want to say $600 million, I believe. He is distributing throughout the state to purchase hotels and motels that have been being used for quarantine and isolation because they were empty, for homeless people largely, but also for older people and other at-risk people. They're buying them. Kaiser Permanente and another private sector entity are funding 2 years worth of rental subsidy from the private sector so that people that move into those can get on their feet as permanent housing, or it could be, that it's a step before moving into another kind of housing. But I think to your point, there are opportunities. There is willingness now to do things differently. And we really should be trying to figure out how to take advantage of that in the district.
Is HUD much of a player? It has it for good or ill. I mean, it's here in Washington. It is funded through appropriation. It's there. Is it really living up to its possibilities now? Is it a real partner as you try to move ahead in your various functions?
I would say we're seeing HUD's involvement more in deals that we would have kept in-house, from acquisition through development through permanent financing, because first of all, the barrier of entry, the expense, particularly with nonprofit developers, of acquiring things at market, developing them at market, and then intentionally leasing them below market creates a financing gap. Certain clients of mine that push the lowest common denominator of area median income, the deals don't underwrite for us to put a permanent loan on there unless we've got HUD to take out our construction loan. HUD has the ability to go 35, 40-year fixed rates at lower rates than we can source. So we're seeing more of that in recent years than in the early years, where we refi portfolio properties that the client had had for years, and our traditional 30-year maximum mortgage would work.
Has the unusual interest rate scene that we've had now for a long time, and it looks like will continue, made some things easier?
Definitely. If it's all about affordability, having less debt service is certainly a plus. The bank's not making as much money, but that's okay.
It also means you can leverage, you can borrow more, and therefore you need less gap subsidy from the district or whatever the public agency is, which means they can spread that around to other projects. Unfortunately, HUD, one sort of countervailing thing that's happened with COVID is a couple of development projects we were trying to move forward with HUD financing. They came in at the last minute and said, oh, because of COVID, you need to build in a 9-month debt service and operating reserve, which added, in one case, $800,000, in another case, $1 million to the budget, and those deals are just on hold and can't move forward with that kind of last-minute added cost to the structure. So COVID, in that case, has made HUD a less useful resource, despite the very low-income environment that could be a real benefit to producing more affordable housing.
I want to talk a little bit about the unique challenges of homelessness and how it differs. You know, we've been doing this symposium through Friendship Place for many years. And for many of those years, we've talked largely, not exclusively, but largely, about homeless individuals, people facing the confluence of challenging circumstances that leave them unhoused, and the steps that need to be taken to get them back in housing. But families, it would seem to me, present different challenges that go beyond mere numbers, getting 4 people under a roof instead of 1. What's different about family homelessness that has to be taken into account when designing responses? Michele?
So one of the things that particularly in the district has been a concern is certainly the availability of larger units to meet family needs. So we have a lot of 1-bedroom studios, 2 bedrooms, potentially 3. But when you have a family that may need a 4 or even 5-bedroom home, they're not as available in the market and also are certainly considerably more expensive. I think just in terms of COVID and what I see with my clients is really thinking about how we now help families meet the needs of children who are learning virtually, how they're able to pursue any other family goals, such as increased employment or other things when they do have, like all parents at this point, have the need to begin to be responsible for education and childcare in the home and not have the availability of supports, whether they be paid supports or even familial supports that would, under other circumstances, be available. So it really has changed the landscape for, I think, how we begin to serve family households, how we create opportunities for them to remain housed here in the district, for some of them who are district residents their whole lives. And so I think that's going to be an important thing to look at as we move forward in planning for housing.
And it's really hard to imagine in the near term how to address that. If you have the demands of work and suddenly children 4, 6, and 11 who were in elementary school and middle school are home all day, where the unit is located is suddenly much more critical. Whether custodial care is needed while you try to continue a tenure at work without getting fired. I mean, it's just a horrendous set of challenges.
It is definitely, and I think we're all just figuring out how to navigate through that world. But certainly people who didn't have as much resource to start out with, it's even more challenging.
This is Nan. I could just add in another thing that we've been seeing around families is the domestic violence issues. So there's been an uptick in domestic violence, and a report just came out that said that women who've left their household because of domestic violence, having a harder time finding other housing. Security issues around that, I think, is another barrier or challenge, I guess, to meeting the needs of families that are homeless.
Is it one of those things where we just say, oh, this is terrible and wring our hands, or is there actually some sort of response that makes sense and can be rolled out quickly? We're talking about people who have to figure these things out right now.
Yeah. With respect to the domestic violence situation, there definitely are responses about how to do that. And there's a lot of choice involved in security issues. It's just that, I just was on another webinar talking about a survey that we had done at the Alliance. We've done it twice now with all the homeless programs around the country or homeless systems around the country. And they're just overwhelmed. I mean, that they're really struggling. They've lost staff themselves. The staff, either has to stay home with their kids or they're sick, or they've had to deconcentrate shelters. This is an issue with taking care of families while they're homeless and individuals. They can't, they have to meet the CDC guidelines. They have to quarantine people, isolate people. All of that requires more staff. They don't have more staff. They can't onboard more staff. So it's not like we don't have answers to some of these things, but it's a difficult time to implement anything because people just are overwhelmed.
Earlier in the conversation, it was mentioned that zoning laws play some roles in this, in reducing housing and increasing rents. What's the mechanism? I think it was you, Mr. Hayward, who made that point. How does that work? How do zoning decisions percolate through the system and have an effect on not only the availability of housing, but what it costs?
So let's first talk with density. So one of the ways that you limit how many units can be built, thus how many units are left for affordability, is you could say only X amount of units can be on a plot of land. And so if you have a restriction on how many units per acre are there, fewer units can be built, thus less of affordability. So if you loosen that, you'll be okay. Also, if you look at the height of buildings. And so in the district, for instance, there is a limit to how tall you can actually build a building for housing. That limits how many units that you can build that could be affordable. These are simple things that you can just go into your local government and say, I'm sorry, we really need you to relax some of these zoning laws so that developers, be they for-profit or nonprofit, can build more affordable units. If you can build more units, simple supply demand is more units will mean the price of the units will at least stabilize a bit, and you have much more of a chance of things at least not escalating to the way they're escalating today.
I know why the height restrictions exist, and any visitor to DC from around the country walking downtown in the monumental heart of the Capitol might appreciate that there are no tall buildings there down by the National Mall or near the Washington Monument or so on. But when you think of radiating circles away from monumental core DC, is anybody going to the mat for? Is anybody making the argument for? Does it look like they can make that argument successfully for loosening of the height restriction, of more density? I live just a few blocks away from the old Fannie Mae headquarters, and a lot of big stuff is getting built around there. I don't know how much complaining happened before there were piles being driven into the ground, but there's some big stuff being built. And Cathedral Commons, just down the block from the old Fannie Mae headquarters, big comprehensive retail and residential development. Is the problem what's being built rather than the density? I mean, if there were more units in Cathedral Commons that were affordable, might there have been more static in the neighborhood about getting a big development with a lot of high-end units built?
So I actually think that the focus should be on more units, and here's why I say this. For this to happen right, the tax base has to be at a place where you're growing the tax base. So you don't want everything to be affordable. That really won't help. And also, you want schools to be in a place where you have mixed income schools, so that people have an opportunity to grow their families and have a good education for their kids. So my view of it is more units is always better than more high income units. You want more units, but you need a mix. And the issue with a place like Cathedral Commons is, I agree with you, there aren't really any low income units that were built as part of that approval, and there probably should have been. But I think for communities to think about this, now those people in that particular neighborhood probably wouldn't have wanted low income units in their neighborhood, and I have real issue with that, but I'll stay out of that discussion right now.
James Campbell, a lot more people haven't seen the inside of their office, or do 1 day a week, or sometimes 2 days a week. Have things changed in such a way that we may see lower demand for commercial office space? Is it convertible to residential? Is that complicated? Is it very expensive? These are things I just don't know. But if an office building is simply no longer needed to be a big office building anymore, can you turn it into an apartment house?
You can. There's a strong history of adaptive reuse of former office buildings. DC is a little more complicated because of that height limit, and you end up having these sort of very large, massive floor plates where a taller high-rise office building tends to have floor plates that might be more adaptable to residential. But it's still doable. There are a lot of strategies to do it. And I think you're absolutely right that with the shakeout, one thing that everybody's learning, we're learning it, a lot of people are very productive not in the office. There's still a role for office, but maybe it's 50% of the space we needed or had before, or 60%. And the same thing with all the law firms in DC. So there's going to be a lot of available real estate. Baltimore has been a big example of adaptive reuse of their entire downtown core. which used to be office and is now predominantly apartments. And I think that to throw a little sunshine on DC, on the zoning issue, they are trying to change their zoning. They're changing their comprehensive plan, adding significant density to what can be built in otherwise affluent neighborhoods west of Rock Creek Park. Ray, our office is not too far from where you live, and all of those developments along Wisconsin. The mayor is pushing hard to increase what can be built there, not any taller, but taller than the height limits of the district, but much more dense and with an affordability component. They've increased the targeting of inclusionary zoning, not as much as it could be and should be. They've mandated that any public parcel that gets put out for redevelopment has to have 30% of the units be affordable. So there are things that the district is attempting to do using the zoning code to address the issues that Jeffrey talked about.
Story about Franklin Roosevelt during the worst years of the Depression, having activists in the Oval Office urging him to adopt a new program. And he said, or is said to have said at the end of the conversation, "I agree with you. Now go out there and make me do it." He understood that outside pressure is a part of the game. How can Friendship Place or similar community providers partner with developers, with financiers to serve the needs of individuals and families experiencing homelessness? What's the necessary interlocking of the array of groups that are out there that make this potentially very productive and workable? Who wants to get us started?
I would say most of our clients are advocacy-minded nonprofits that over a period of evolution took more of an activist role besides just raising awareness, and got into development and got into promoting ancillary services. I've continued to be amazed, and some of these were outgrowths of religious organizations that their position was, well, rather than have folks come to the church, let's go out into the community. So I have been amazed in the years that I've been doing this, how that passion, and I say this because I view the nonprofit world particularly as collaborative competitors. Yeah, they're all looking for grants from some of the same sources. They're all looking for awards from the city relative to various projects. At the end of the day, they have a business to run, but if a competitor wins that project, maybe they get the next one, but the mission has been achieved. And so I think that cohesiveness and the fact that it's not just housing, it's the ancillary services that evolve over time. It's a very powerful voice. And most of my clients have been down to the district building and Capitol Hill, particularly this summer, arguing for an increase in that CARES Act allocation that went out to the states at $1.2 billion, but the city got, what, about 700,000 of that. So the passion is really overwhelming.
And Ray, if I could, tying in specifically to your question about nonprofits working in the homeless space, partnering with developers, both nonprofit developers, but also for-profit developers. We have partnered with a number of nonprofits who work in both providing services but also all of the issues around trying to address housing for people at risk and formerly homeless, where they are part of our development team. They are an integral component because we need their expertise for whatever set aside there is. And we've had some properties where there's a 30% set aside. We have some other properties where there's like a 12, 15% set aside for formerly homeless at-risk households. One property where 90%. But in every case, we need somebody who has that true expertise. In the district, partnering with a nonprofit also brings some real economic benefits. If you structure your organization appropriately, you get a 100% tax abatement for real estate taxes. And so that brings a real resource of stretching those dollars. And in stretching those dollars, we then try to enable that project to self-fund the services, the wraparound services, to help ensure that those households have a chance of success. So there's great opportunities for developers like us to partner with nonprofits and attack the homelessness issue.
Anyone else? On that point, partnerships and okay. I want to go to questions from our audience. Dorothy asks, can we address the issue of the existing homeless population in addition to those who may be coming online from eviction? How do we do those two very demanding and challenging things? Nan?
Well, I think it's absolutely imperative that we do address the problems of the existing population. Not to get too in the weeds of homelessness policy, but really reducing the number of homeless people is all about getting people faster into housing. If you leave people in the shelter system, it just compounds. So we do really need to try to get as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, out of the shelter system and into housing. People who are homeless generally have to have a rental subsidy at the moment. Even if there's no debt on the building, really just to run it, they're going to need help to pay their rent, at least for a few years. So we need to get people out of the homeless system. I think we can expect that there's going to be an increase in homelessness as a result of the recession. There have been for previous recessions. It's probably not going to be immediate, but we don't want to compound our problems. We already have a high unsheltered rate. We need to move people along into housing. And we're going to need financial assistance to do that, both from the city and from the federal government, form of rent subsidies.
Else on that point? When we talk about homeless people, asks Stanley, aren't we talking also about emotionally challenged people? Michele?
So no more emotionally challenged than anyone in the general population. So, people are people. Some of them came into homelessness because of the same things that people are facing now. Loss of job, right? Loss of employment, businesses going under. And so it's a compounding problem. And as Nan said, what we know is that the faster that we can help someone who becomes homeless reestablish themselves in housing, the better off they are. And I think what we know now through the COVID crisis is the more that our neighbor finds success, the more we find success, because our health, our outcomes are intimately tied together with everyone else.
And I want to remind our participants, and there are many of you watching this webinar, that you can join in on the questioning by using the Q&A function in the lower part of the Zoom screen. What can corporations do to better promote availability of low-income housing? Well, that's kind of the nut question, isn't it? It's the core of everything we've been talking about. Are there things that aren't being done that are already in their wheelhouse? Are there functions that they aren't performing that they might do in this instance?
I would just mention one kind of corporation, and that is the insurance companies, health insurance companies. I mentioned Kaiser before. I think one thing that has happened is that, housing affects the bottom line for a lot of different kinds of companies, not all kinds. And in the case of healthcare, housing really is healthcare. It improves healthcare and it reduces cost to insurance companies. So I think if there were more insurance companies that had a clear understanding of this, they could make investments in affordable housing because it would save them on their own bottom line. and that's a sector that I think the COVID experience is elevating in terms of the understanding of housing as a healthcare intervention.
You know, coming out of the Second World War, where there were vacancy crises in a lot of urban markets because no new housing had been built since the late 20s, with Depression and then World War II, insurance companies were big investors in middle-income housing and high-density multiple unit housing in a lot of urban cores. And we seem to forget that now, but they had a lot of cash because they had a lot of customers. And one place where they could profitably park that cash was in housing that developed a return, paid off the costs of development, and often anchored parts of the city where they were built for decades to come. Nan, you're right. I mean, it seems like a natural. Often employment is a barrier to affording decent housing. Can corporations think of creative ways to help expand their own workforce to build a base of people who can afford low-income housing? Well, we're giving a lot of assignments to corporations today.
I think part of, not to pick on them, but if Amazon is coming to our local jurisdiction, and they're coming with a lot of high wage jobs, but also not so high wage jobs. I mean, if you're going to feed your workforce, there have to be people who actually prepare the food and do other things like that. I think what we all have to do as parts of the government, as private citizens, is when we consider requests like, tax abatements, part of that package deal ought to be a housing request. It shouldn't be they're just moving in and we're going to give you a big tax abatement for bringing all these jobs here. What are the quality of the jobs? And then what are you doing about housing? And we have to be ready with plans we can give companies that say, here's a blueprint, because they're not housing people. So to ask them to do something to help housing, it might not be fair if we don't have, listen, here's a blueprint for you Amazon, you Google, whoever the company is. And often these larger companies actually have a commitment that they have made to housing. So it's not like you're asking them to do something they don't want to do. I think Microsoft committed $1 billion for affordable housing. I think other companies in the Silicon Valley did that. And so there is a blueprint now where companies want to do something. I think our challenge is how do we bring it to them in a way they can execute what they want to do?
Jeffrey asks, people seeking housing look across the region since no one jurisdiction has enough deeply affordable housing stock, particularly in the DMV. We need a regional approach, yes?
I totally agree. I think focusing on just DC proper is probably not the right thing to do. And there is evidence of there being kind of regional councils that are focused on housing. I just don't, frankly, on my own, don't know how effective they are, but I know that some of them exist.
As a reporter who's covered urban, go ahead, Joe.
Just to say, and we've seen in recent years, unknown or specific jurisdiction, AHC, for instance, or MHME, migrating across borders, doing deals in Maryland when they're based in Virginia, doing deals in DC when they're based in Maryland. So there is that sensitivity to that. It's a regional issue.
Whenever I hear about regional planning and, multi-jurisdiction planning, I get a little skeptical as someone who's covered urban governance for a long time. It is sometimes a function of getting all the desirable stuff to come to your jurisdiction and the somewhat less desirable stuff to go to other people's jurisdiction as part of the regional planning process. I can't imagine Montgomery County saying, you know what, district, you take that very desirable, very profitable, very terrific thing. We've got enough already, okay? I just don't see it happening. And similarly, given the some of the bruising fights that happened in Northern Virginia over the siting of new development, it's hard to imagine places foregoing things that may increase the tax base, fatten up the real estate tax receipts and so on, because it might be better put somewhere else in terms of transit, in terms of where the jobs are and so on. But yes, a regional approach would be great, but I get a little skeptical when I hear about it. William asks, what is happening to make sure existing low-income housing units in DC aren't lost to development? First off, is that happening? Second off, is there really any way to stop it? I mean, there's a lot of redevelopment going on all around the city.
We're seeing in our practice a number of corporate and institutional investor pools being formed. One is the Washington Housing Initiative that is spearheaded by JBG, and a number of banks like ourselves were significant investors in that. Their approach is get the property under control or it gets too gentrified. Easier to put up 10 affordable units when it's still affordable, as opposed to trying to carve those 10 units out of a 100-unit market development. I've also had nonprofit developers who realized, no offense, Jim, that they don't have maybe the capacity that a for-profit development might have and the ability to move quickly. So they, in turn, did their own version of a fund, again, heavily populated by like-minded philanthropic folks, banks, et cetera, and that allowed them to quickly acquire four properties in the Adams-Morgan neighborhood to prevent them from becoming more condominiums. So there is kind of an institutional look at things now. I've also heard that investors are becoming more interested in multifamily because, as I said earlier, it's viewed as a safer asset property class in times like these.
Anyone else on that point?
Yeah, I think to add to that, the district does have what's called the Preservation Task Force, where they've identified every single subsidized property in the district, subsidized either with low-income housing tax credits or Section 8 subsidies, that are reaching the end of their compliance period, reaching to the termination point for that contract, and are trying to track those to see how they can be preserved and take a proactive approach to sort of getting out in front rather than finding out that it's been sold off to a market developer. And so that's been pretty helpful. The other tool that the district has is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which gives tenants the right to match any offer. And they usually need to do that working in conjunction with a like-minded developer who wants to preserve the housing with them and for them. But it's a tool that, if nothing else, enables the buying of time, because the market is so hot, a typical transaction closes in 60 to 90 days. You can delay something out to a year and a half using the TOPA process to assemble the resources you need to preserve it as ongoing affordable housing.
Hugh asks, is it easy to use words like social cohesion and mixed-use housing when we're really also facing racial, ethnic, cultural, and values differences among people that could lead to conflicts? Are we not addressing that in our high-minded and thoughtful and careful conversation, that some of this down at ground level is a bruising and sometimes uncomfortable struggle?
Well, I'll just
I knew not
say,
everybody would be jumping in on this one. Go ahead, Nick.
I mean, obviously that's very true. And I first got involved with Friendship Place, for example, because I live near a house that at the time we were trying to purchase that would house 5 people who had previously been living under the overhang at the community center. And it was a battle royal to get that house. Although I will say, and this often does happen, not always, that once folks got moved into the house, there were not largely issues with the neighbors at all, with one exception. But So I think it is a very challenging thing, obviously. And when you're talking about the cost of housing and getting housing done and the length of time, and a large issue most places also is the neighborhood pushback against, which has come up before, against any affordable housing, and the unwillingness. And often neighbors are not terribly receptive to new people moving in. And I would say we have seen that to some extent with the shelter here in Northwest for families. So it is a huge issue, and we have to be aggressive and affirmative in addressing it. And I'm sure that Jim and others have had a lot of experience with this as well.
This is Michelle. I think when I hear that question, I think there's no other choice but to face those conflicts, because we certainly don't resolve them by restricting people who we're not comfortable with from moving into our neighborhood. And so if we're really going to achieve what I believe we've all come to understand needs to be addressed in our communities around racial equity, then we have to be willing to stand up and to face these conflicts and talk with our neighbors and, really push people through that uncomfortability, so that we can really get past these types of conflicts.
And I totally agree with you, Michelle. And I think there's a tendency to want to bury this conversation and bury any discussion about this any place we can bury it because it's so uncomfortable. And I think we just have to shine a light when there is conflict on it, because we'll never get to resolving these conflicts unless we actually shine a bright light and say, this is an issue that we all have some accountability for.
Well, Nan mentioned it. Ann wants to ask about Mayor Bowser's plan to expand DC's housing stock across the wards. How's that going in the implementation? Is it working out? Do the battles continue? Any thoughts on how that's progressing?
The battle continues. I think the zoning, the revision to the comprehensive plan has to be put in place to help really move that along. What they have done is in the scoring process for the allocation of district resources, they've given preference to affordable housing developments that are in opportunity neighborhoods, as they call them, which is really more affluent neighborhoods that have kept affordable housing out. It's still an issue west of the park. It's still an issue, but what has happened in some of the neighborhood meetings in Henrytown and Van Ness is people who would have come out before and very much in an NIMBY approach are hearing a different message and are hearing some education moments with the history of redlining and covenants that are pervasive in DC and throughout. And it seems like, at least some of the anecdotal feedback I'm getting, is that it's making some of the conflict less aggressive than may have been the case in the past. A lot of steps to go before that translates into actual housing on the ground in those neighborhoods.
When I've covered battles like that in the past, Jim, I've found that if people feel secure, they're less likely to be screaming opponents. I'm not going to lose all my chestnuts. The value of my house is not going to go down. I don't have to turn up at these meetings and yell at the people. Has the run-up in the value of DC housing sort of taken the edge off of some of these things, that some neighborhoods are, here to stay? They're not in a fragile, tenuous, they could go either way kind of condition.
It's interesting. I think that is a very relevant point to perhaps mitigate some of that anxiety people had. But we also found in a couple of projects where there was a lot of immediate neighborhood resistance to the plan to preserve the very low income housing that, and there was some meetings planned, and it was clearly kind of an ambush setup. And we would walk in with residents from the low income community, and all of a sudden they became actual people. They became real people, not just a symbolic image of someone who people had a scary image of, or someone who they could just isolate mentally. They became real, and they had to look the person in the eye. They had to hear the person say, I'm also afraid for my kids playing out in these streets, and share the same concerns that you do. And it really transformed the dynamic, and all of a sudden we got letters of support from those neighborhood groups, as opposed to what was clearly going down a path of opposition.
Jillian asks, are there any innovative designs used in either the public or private sector to support those experiencing homelessness or combating homelessness? Are there working models that might be exportable? And some other people have asked an aspect of that question. Are there things for a high-cost jurisdiction like DC to learn from what other places are doing or have done?
There is some promising, I think, evidence that accessory dwelling units could be used as a way to house homeless, assuming that the property owners are willing to take, let's say, a government subsidy or something like that for rent. But the idea that for these, in places where it's not really dense, where you can build another unit, if there is rental subsidy, that is a place to get supply. You can build an accessory unit on in some cities, and I think that is a place to look for adding more units in a city like DC.
Yanis asks, should we be empowering residents to handle the maintenance of their units instead of entrusting inefficient and ineffective governmental bureaucracies through voucher systems, similar to school vouchers? What would be some of the pros and cons of a bottom-up approach?
One unique type of housing that we see here in DC is a limited equity co-op, which has been around probably, 50 years. And in short, it's the ability to benefit from some degree of home ownership appreciation without having that property ultimately become gentrified and beyond people's ability to pay. And one thing we've learned in doing some of those, and they used to be tenant occupied, they formed a cooperative, the city provides them with some finance to acquire the building, is that heightened sense of responsibility. It's pride of ownership, I'm not sure what you call it, but they do tend to work out pretty well. It's community association, there's strength in numbers. So there is that little niche where we've seen that kind of development play out.
And I ask, in our guarantee business, in Fannie Mae's guarantee business, we have financed a number of these limited equity co-ops, and I totally agree with you. I think generally there's a certain esprit de corps with these things because of the form of ownership, the cooperative form of ownership, where people really care something about these properties. And we've had great success, and we've done a lot of business with the National Co-op Bank in that regard. But I think that's a great idea, and I wish I saw it more.
And I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to make their final comments before we close the program for today. In the opening remarks, Michele, you went last, so like scripture tells us, the last will be first. So you get to go first this time.
Great. I just want to thank everyone on the panel for the conversation and the participants for their questions. This has been a very engaging and enlightening discussion. And I think the takeaway is that it is not, no one particular sector or entity has the answer, and it's going to take all of us working together to ensure that we can continue to help people obtain and maintain housing in our communities.
Jim Campbell?
I just want to take the opportunity to thank the panel and Ray and Friendship Place for sponsoring this, but also for the work that Friendship Place does every single day to address the needs of people here in the district who are facing homelessness. I think a lot of great ideas have been discussed here. And again, as I said at the beginning, we need to put our collective brains together to come up with creative solutions to build more and subsidize more housing that will address this need.
Nan.
Well, I just want to thank those of you on the panel that are doing the affordable housing. I know it's so complicated, difficult. Every unit is difficult to bring online, but it's so critical. We just have to increase the supply and provide more rental subsidy. It's a big mistake for us to allow all of these tens of thousands of families and hundreds of thousands of individuals to be homeless. It exacts great cost on us as a nation. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. And thank you, Ray, for your great questions.
Thanks a lot. Jeffrey Hayward.
I want to thank, again, Friendship Place for putting this together and NYU for putting this together. This has been terrific. I'd say I'm even more motivated to do my part to help deal with some of these problems, both from a corporate standpoint and from a personal standpoint. And I think partnerships are the answer. And I hope even from this conversation that some partnerships are formed that are looking to do more to solve the problem. Thank you again.
Laments.
So I go last. I'm reminded of a quote that George Will used in an article a week or so back, which he attributed to Lenin, but anyway, I thought it was interesting. And I think to paraphrase 2020, it's going to be one of those years we remember like 68, if anybody was around for 41 and years like that. But Will says that, there's decades where nothing happens, and then the paraphrase, and then there's years like 2020 where decades happen. And I think this is one of those years, and I think it's the combined ingenuity and creativity and perseverance that times like these create in people where, yeah, it's going to be tough sledding. There's a great degree of uncertainty, but we will rise above it and find a way to get it done. It won't be pretty, it'll be bumpy, but I'm encouraged that I think this is one of those years that wakes everybody up.
I want to thank all the panelists for their thorough and thoughtful contributions. It made my job easy. And to close us out, we'll return to Jean-Michel and Christopher Rutledge.
Well, I want to thank everybody for helping us with this this afternoon. Thank you to all the panelists for this high-level conversation. And thank you to you, Ray, for coming back to us for another year to moderate the symposium. We appreciate your help, you know that. Thank you to the audience members as well, and to everybody who supports Friendship Place. We appreciate you.
Building on what Jean-Michel had to say, yes, thank you everybody for being a part of this today. Watching the numbers of people who participated, we actually saw more people tune in for this than we've had at our last few live symposiums, which really does speak to the value of this virtual world, that there is so much great that can be done. And reiterating also what Jean-Michel said, Ray, thank you. You've done this for so many years for us. It's invaluable. And Michelle, Nan, Joe, Jim, Jeffrey, all of you for being a part of this in such a lively conversation. Great questions from our audience. And I do want to thank all of our supporters and friends. We do this work because of your generosity. We can't do it without your help. Your gifts, your contributions really do make the difference and allow us to put on activities like this that aren't government funded, but are so important to getting the word out about the work that we're doing and to surfacing some creative ideas. So thank you. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. I don't think there was any other closing comments, but Ray, once more, thank you for being a part of this. Take care.
A moderator has two jobs. One is to run a good conversation. The second one is to get off on time. And we just did. Thanks a lot, everybody.